It was supposed to be just another day in court, another case, another file on the judge's desk. But when his eyes lifted from the papers, everything changed. In front of him sat a man in handcuffs, a defendant like countless others. Yet this face stopped his heart cold. It was familiar, too familiar. The boy he once knew, the friend he had grown up with, now shackled and branded a criminal. What unfolded inside that courtroom was more than a trial. It was a collision of past and present, justice and prejudice. And the verdict would expose a truth no one was prepared to face. The courthouse was alive with the hum of routine. Lawyers juggled folders, clerks typed furiously, and nervous families whispered in hushed tones. To the outside world, this was just another morning. But for Marcus Hayes, it was the morning his life would be placed on trial, not just his name. At T36, Marcus had become an expert at surviving in the shadows. He wasn't famous, he wasn't rich, and he wasn't dangerous, not in the way society liked to pretend. He was a man who worked odd jobs, who carried groceries for his elderly mother, who fixed cars for neighbors when they couldn't afford. The mechanic. To those who truly knew him, Marcus was dependable, quiet, steady. But to the system, he was a file with a record attached, a single mistake from his teenage years that clung to him like a curse he could never shake. Marcus grew up in the east side of town, a place forgotten by developers but remembered by police. The sidewalks cracked under decades of neglect, corner stores doubled as survival hubs, and ambition often withered before it could bloom. Yet Marcus had once dared to dream. As a child, he sketched bridges and buildings in worn notebooks, telling his friends he wanted to design structures that would outlast him. But dreams like that rarely made it out of neighborhoods like his. School had been his first battleground. He asked questions, hungry to learn, but instead of praise, he was labeled disruptive. When textbooks were too outdated to answer his curiosity, teachers accused him of being lazy. And when he dared to defend himself, his tone was cold, angry. Slowly, the world shaped the narrative for him. Troublemaker, problem, threat. Labels that stuck even when he tried to peel them away. Still, Marcus carried on. He didn't fall into the traps that swallowed so many of his friends. He avoided gangs, resisted drugs, and refused to let bitterness harden him. But one fight in high school, a scuffle he hadn't even started, gave him a criminal record. From then on, every job application, every apartment search, every step forward seemed to slam into the same locked door. Yet, despite the setbacks, Marcus never stopped trying. He took night shifts cleaning restaurants, long days hauling boxes, whatever work kept food on the table. He cared for his mother when her health declined, walked his niece to school, and did his best to prove to the world and to himself that he was more than the mistakes written on paper. But that morning, as he sat in the defendant's chair, hands cuffed, eyes steady, Marcus could feel the familiar weight of judgment pressing down. To the jury, he was not Marcus Hayes. He was a black man accused of theft. And in a system where innocence often carried less weight than perception, that was enough to tip the scales against him. Across the courtroom, Judge Daniel Whitaker adjusted his glasses, scanning the case file. To him, this was supposed to be routine. Another docket, another defendant, another day of maintaining order. Daniel had built his reputation on being firm but fair, a man who trusted in the law because, for him, the law had always worked. He had been raised in safety, educated in privilege, protected by a system that had never doubted him. But when he finally looked up from the papers, his breath caught. The man in chains before him wasn't just a stranger. It was Marcus. A flood of memories came rushing back. Two boys racing their bikes down broken pavement, sharing peanut butter sandwiches, whispering about what they wanted to be when they grew up. For Daniel, it was like time had folded in on itself, showing him the brutal contrast between two paths that had once been so close. And now, here they were. One boy had become a judge, the other a defendant. The courtroom went on around them, attorneys shifting files, jurors settling in, the clerk calling order. But for Daniel, everything else blurred. He was staring at the ghost of his own childhood, alive but trapped in a system that had decided his worth long ago. The gavel came down. The trial began. And no one else in that room realized that this case was about to become far more than a question of guilt or innocence. It was about to expose a truth deeper than evidence, harsher than any verdict, and heavier than any sentence, and, once revealed, it would haunt everyone who witnessed it. The trial moved forward like a machine, efficient, cold, unyielding. Papers shuffled, voices echoed, and Marcus sat silently, a man swallowed by a process designed to speak over him. To most in that room, he wasn't Marcus Hayes. He was case #1174. The prosecution wasted no time painting him as a career criminal. They described him as someone who had grown up in a dangerous neighborhood, whose past record was proof of his tendencies. Their words dripped with carefully coded language, each phrase chosen to feed into unspoken fears. They never said because he's black, but every insinuation carried that weight. The evidence, circumstantial. A stolen watch found blocks from Marcus's home. A witness who claimed they saw a man who looked like him. Nothing definitive, nothing concrete, yet enough in the prosecutor's eyes to turn suspicion into certainty. Marcus's defense attorney tried to push back, but she was young, overworked, and juggling too many cases. Her arguments, though passionate, seemed drowned out in the tide of the prosecution's confidence. To the jury, she looked like she was grasping at straws, while the other side appeared steady, composed, rehearsed. Judge Daniel Whitaker listened, outwardly composed. But inside, his thoughts churned. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus as a boy, the kid who always carried a notebook, sketching rooftops and bridges, telling Daniel he'd one day design cities. And yet here Marcus sat, his wrists bound in steel. Daniel's mind whispered questions he had never let himself ask. How many others had sat in that chair, accused, condemned, dismissed, while he told himself the law was fair? How many had he sentenced, blind to the forces that had pushed them there? He shifted uncomfortably as the prosecution paraded witnesses, each one shaky, inconsistent, but all pointing to Marcus as the man who had committed the theft. The jurors leaned forward, hanging onto each word, their eyes darting toward Marcus with suspicion. Daniel could see the subtle tightening of their jaws, the way their gazes hardened. They had already begun to decide. Marcus felt it too. He sat still, back straight, refusing to let fear show, but inside, his chest burned. He had lived this moment 100 times before, in traffic stops that dragged too long, in store aisles where he was followed, in job interviews that ended. The moment his record came up, he knew what it meant to be presumed guilty before he could even speak. The weight in the room grew heavier with each passing hour. Evidence blurred into insinuations, insinuations into assumptions. And all the while, Marcus's life hung in the balance. By midday, the tension was suffocating. The defense brought in Marcus's employer, who vouched for his honesty, his reliability, his character. But the prosecution twisted it. Of course, an employer would defend his worker. Loyalty can cloud judgment. The employer left the stand, looking defeated, and Marcus felt another thread of hope snap inside him. In the gallery, whispers stirred. People exchanged looks, their expressions skeptical, guarded. Some shook their heads as if the verdict was already sealed. Marcus could feel their judgment, like invisible hands pressing him further into his chair. And Daniel felt trapped. As judge, he was supposed to be impartial, neutral, untouched by personal TIs. But how could he be impartial when the man before him wasn't just a defendant? He was the boy who once dreamed of building bridges, and now he was being crushed under one. The prosecutor's closing remarks thundered through the courtroom. This is not about speculation. This is about safety, about protecting our community. We cannot allow men like Marcus Hayes to slip through the cracks. Men like Marcus Hayes. The phrase echoed like a verdict before the verdict. The defense tried to respond, but the jury's eyes were glazed with certainty. The decision felt inevitable. As the judge prepared to dismiss for deliberation, he glanced once more at Marcus. For a brief second, their eyes met. Daniel saw not a criminal, not a case file, but the boy he once raced down cracked sidewalks with, the boy who still existed beneath the weight of prejudice and time. And in that silent exchange, a storm brewed, Because Daniel knew something the jury didn't, something that could unravel everything. But revealing it would come at a cost neither man could have imagined. The jury filed back into the room, their faces stiff and unreadable. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating. Each step of their return echoed like a drumbeat, pulling Marcus closer to the edge of a cliff he hadn't chosen to stand on. The bailiff called for silence. Chairs creaked as everyone shifted forward, waiting for the words that would decide Marcus's fate. Marcus sat perfectly still, his pulse thudded in his ears, but he refused to lower his eyes. He had done this before, weathered suspicion, swallowed humiliation, carried the crushing weight of being judged before being heard. But this moment was different. This wasn't a traffic stop or a lost job interview. This was a verdict that could carve the rest of his life into stone. The jury foreman stood, clutching the slip of paper like it was a weapon. He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Daniel Whitaker. Daniel's hands trembled ever so slightly as he unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words. His breath caught. The room seemed to tilt. Guilty. The word sliced through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Marcus's mother clutched her chest, whispering his name. Marcus's stomach dropped, but he didn't flinch. He had prepared himself for this, though no preparation could dull the sting. The jury looked satisfied, as if they had restored some imaginary balance to the world. The prosecutor's lips curled into the faintest smirk, but Daniel's face paled. He was supposed to read the verdict aloud, stamp it with the authority of the court. Instead, his mind raced back to a summer afternoon when he and Marcus were 12 years old, racing bikes down the cracked pavement of their block. Marcus had crashed, scraping his knee. Daniel had offered his hand, pulling his friend up. He remembered Marcus's laugh, bright and unbroken by the world's cruelty. And now, here he was, shackled, condemned, with no one to pull him up. The courtroom waited. Silence pressed down, demanding the ritual be completed. But Daniel couldn't breathe. He couldn't swallow the lie that had just been delivered to him. His eyes flicked to the prosecution's evidence, thin, circumstantial, full of holes. He thought about the witness who had hesitated before pointing to Marcus, the inconsistencies ignored, the employer's defense brushed aside. He thought about the phrase, "men like Marcus Hayes," and suddenly, it hit him with the force of a hammer. This wasn't justice. This was theater, a performance dressed in legal language, powered by bias, and sealed by fear. Daniel's gavel hovered in his hand. He was supposed to bring it down, to finalize the verdict, but his arm felt like stone. Whispers spread. The gallery leaned in. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, sensing hesitation. The defense attorney glanced up, startled. Marcus stared at Daniel, calm but unblinking, and in that silent stare, Daniel felt the weight of every decision he had ever made. How many men like Marcus had he sentenced without question? How many dreams had he signed away with a flick of his pen? For the first time in his career, he saw the truth. The law wasn't blind. It saw everything: color, class, poverty, and it punished accordingly. The bailiff shifted impatiently. "Your Honor?" Daniel's heart pounded. This was the line. If he crossed it, he would tear open a wound the system wanted to keep hidden. If he stayed silent, Marcus's life would be swallowed like so many before him. His hand shook as he gripped the gavel. Then, slowly, he set it down. The room gasped. Daniel's voice cracked, but it was steady enough to carry. "This court cannot, in good conscience, accept this verdict." Chaos erupted. The prosecutor shot to his feet, shouting objections. The jury looked stunned, mouths open in disbelief. The gallery exploded with whispers, shouts, cries. Marcus's chest tightened. He didn't know whether to believe it, whether to trust that, for once, someone inside the system might actually see him. Daniel continued, louder now, his voice trembling with conviction. "This case is built on prejudice, not proof. The evidence presented does not meet the standard of justice, and I will not allow this court to become complicit in condemning an innocent man." The gavel slammed, not to finalize, but to resist, and in that moment, the courtroom was no longer just a room. It was a battlefield. Marcus's life hung on the edge, suspended between freedom and ruin. The system had drawn its line, and Daniel had dared to cross it. But as the echoes of the gavel faded, one question burned hotter than all the rest. Had Daniel just saved his childhood friend? Or had he doomed them both? The courtroom didn't settle. It couldn't. The gavel's echo still vibrated in the walls, a rupture in the ritual everyone expected to unfold neatly. The prosecutor demanded to be heard, his voice rising, indignant, insisting that the judge had crossed a line. The jurors exchanged stunned glances, like actors stripped of a script, but Daniel didn't waver. His words had already left his mouth, and there was no pulling them back. He ordered the case reviewed, evidence re-examined, the verdict set aside until true justice could be pursued. His decision carried the weight of his authority, but also the risk of his career unraveling. He knew it. And yet, for the first time in his long tenure, he felt the strange relief of speaking truth instead of tradition. Marcus sat in silence, his heart thundering. He wanted to believe this moment meant freedom, but years of being broken down by a system designed to cage him made hope feel dangerous. He kept his head high, refusing to let tears betray the storm inside him. Still, a flicker burned. For once, someone in power had refused to look away. The days that followed were a blur of headlines, debates, and outrage. News outlets ran with the story of the judge who refused a verdict. Commentators split along predictable lines. Some called Daniel a hero, others a traitor to the law. Social media lit up with hashtags, arguments, and the voices of those who saw in Marcus's story a reflection of their own lives. Daniel faced inquiries, disciplinary hearings, threats from colleagues who saw him as reckless. His reputation, once spotless, was now stained with controversy. But he didn't regret it. Not when he looked back at the faces he had sentenced in the past, realizing how many might have been another Marcus. The cost of silence was no longer one he was willing to bear. For Marcus, the fight wasn't over. He still had to endure another review, still had to wait in a cell while the system decided if it would correct its own mistake. But something had shifted. People were watching. His name wasn't just a docket number anymore. His story carried weight beyond the walls of the courthouse. And that weight pressed on the conscience of a nation that liked to pretend its justice was blind. Weeks later, the case was dismissed for lack of evidence. Marcus walked out of the courthouse a free man, but not an unscarred one. Freedom didn't erase the months he had spent preparing for a future behind bars, the nights replaying his every step, wondering how it had come to this. It didn't erase the humiliation of chains on his wrists, or the quiet knowledge that if not for a single man's choice, he would have been swallowed whole. Daniel met him outside the courthouse that day. They didn't speak much, words felt small compared to the weight of what had passed. But in their silence, in the shared look between two boys who had grown into men divided by privilege and fate, there was something unspoken: gratitude, regret, and the acknowledgement of a world that had given them two very different maps to navigate the same streets. For Marcus, the fight wasn't just personal anymore. He became a voice, sometimes trembling, sometimes fierce, speaking about the cracks in the system, about the millions whose stories ended differently than his. People listened, not because his experience was unique, but because it was painfully common. And for Daniel, the cost continued. His career never fully recovered. The whispers followed him, the colleagues distanced themselves, the invitations to elite circles stopped coming. But he carried something heavier than reputation now: clarity. He had seen the truth too closely to ever unsee it. And that truth demanded a question he couldn't escape: how many more? How many more Marcuses would sit in chains, branded guilty before evidence even touched a table? How many more would be crushed under verdicts shaped by fear, bias, and silence? How many would never have a friend on the bench to stop the machine from grinding them down? The story didn't end with one man freed. It lingered in the echoes of every courtroom, in the whispers of every family waiting for a verdict, in the lives already written off before they could begin. And as Marcus walked into his uncertain future, and Daniel into his uncertain career, one truth became undeniable: this was never just about a single trial. It was about a system that had been on trial all along, and the verdict is still waiting. So the question remains: how many more lives must be broken before justice finally means what it claims to? Marcus walked free, but freedom didn't erase the scars. And Daniel? He carried the weight of a truth that had shattered his faith in the very system he once served without question. Their story is one of chance, a rare moment when the machine hesitated, when a single person refused to look away. But for every Marcus, how many others never get that chance? How many sit behind bars right now, condemned not by evidence but by perception, by the color of their skin, by the silence of those who could have spoken? This wasn't just one case. It wasn't just one courtroom. It was a mirror held up to all of us. And the reflection isn't easy to face. The question is, what do we do with it? Do we shake our heads, say that's tragic, and move on? Or do we sit with the discomfort, the anger, the injustice, and let it push us to demand something better? Because until stories like Marcus's stop being common, until justice is truly blind, the verdict is still unfinished. So I'll leave you with this. If you were in that courtroom, watching it unfold, would you have spoken up? Would you have stayed silent? And more importantly, what will you do now that you know?